In this video, I'd like to walk students through the second lesson in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Latin Grammar 1 course. As I explained in the first lesson, we're studying the Latin grammar of the Jesuit schoolmaster Emmanuel Alvarez, who lived in the 1500s, 500 years ago. And in our first lesson, we studied de litteris, about letters. And in this the second lesson, we're going to study the partes orationis. Partes orationis, the parts of speech. In our first lesson, we learned that there are 23 letters used by the Latins. We learned that there are 6 vowels in the Latin language. We also learned that there are 6 diphthongs in the Latin language. We learned that a syllable is made out of letters, that a word, or dictio, is made out of syllables, and that a speech, oratio, is made out of words, ex dictionibus. We learned all that in lesson 1, and here we learn the partes orationis, the parts of speech. Lesson 1 might be considered the parts of words. Lesson 2, the parts of speech. The first rule in your lesson in the Latin says partes orationis. That's actually written wrong. Partes orationis sunt octo. And what that means is that the parts of speech are 8. Octo. Just remember, an octopus is an animal that has 8 feet. Octopus. The parts of speech are 8. Okay, now, what are we really talking about when we talk about the parts of speech? Our goal in grammar is to gain mastery of the Latin language. We want to become masters of the Latin language. We want to be able to read and understand it in all of its details, even if we're studying the wisest writers who ever lived. We want to be able to understand what they're saying. We want to understand the words that they use, how they communicate, and to do that, because the ideas that they have are very complex, difficult ideas to communicate. They have to use language in a way that allows them to communicate those ideas, and we have to study the language so that we can understand what they're communicating. Now, if speech is made up of words, it would be impossible to study how to speak, because there are an endless number of words, tens of thousands of words that we would have to study and learn one by one. And there would be no way to do that. It would be impossible for us to learn how to speak or to interpret speech if we had to study all of the words separately, as if in a dictionary. That would be impossible. Or maybe a few people could do it after a long, long time, but it wouldn't be helpful for most people. And this should be a study that many of us, or all of us, can enjoy. What wise men have done is they've divided all of the words into just 8 different classes, or 8 different groups. So rather than having to study all of the words, thousands and thousands of words, which would take us years and years and years, we can simply learn about the 8 different kinds of words that there are. We can learn about each one of these different kinds of words, and when we learn about this kind of word, we will know some important information about all of the words that are this kind of word. When we learn about this kind of word, the the second part of speech. Once we learn what it is, what its characteristics are, we'll know those things about every word that belongs in this class of words. So, rather than try to study every word by itself, which would take forever, we're just going to study the 8 classes of words, which are called the 8 parts of speech, the parts that are used to make up speech. Okay? There are 8 parts of speech. Partes orationis sunt octo. The first part of speech, nomen. Nomen, in English, is translated as noun. But what it really means is just name. The first part of speech, nomen, is a name. So any words that are used as names are nouns, and they belong to the class nomen. Okay? That's the first part of speech. So when we learn about nouns, we'll understand the characteristics of all of the words that are nouns. The second part of speech, pronomen. Pronomen. And we can see that nomen is in the name of the second part of speech. Pro is a Latin word that means in place of or for. Pronomen is a word that is used in the place of a noun. A word used in place of a noun is a pronomen. And in English, we call these pronouns. So nomen, pronomen. And the third part of speech is verbum. In English, you should be able to see that we translate this as verb. Verbum, a verb. Fourth is participium. And in English, we translate this as a participle. A participle. Now, if you have not studied any English grammar, you may not know what these different parts of speech are. If you did study English grammar, you probably have a good idea of what they are, but I'll warn you that when we study a different language, things aren't the same. Languages have different ways of communicating ideas, and so what's called a pronoun in English might not be a pronoun in Latin. What's called an adjective in English, if you look at the 8 parts of speech, there's no adjective, because in Latin an adjective is simply a noun. Okay, so you may be familiar with these ideas from English grammar, but I want you to use that, to understand, but I also want you to ignore that, because as we get into classical grammar, I want you to let these lessons tell you what these words mean, because we're studying Latin grammar now, and it's not the same as English grammar, okay? So the first 4 parts of speech, nomen, pronomen, verbum, and participium. Okay, the first 4. Noun, pronoun, verb, participle in English. The next 4 parts of speech, the first one we have is prepositio. And here's an example of the diphthong a, diphthong. In classical Latin, we would say praepositio. In church Latin, we say prepositio. And this is the English preposition. That's easy enough. You can see that diphthong a, when we pronounce it pre in church Latin, becomes e in English. Preposition. Okay? That's the fifth part of speech. Then we have adverbium, which is simple enough to see that that's an English adverb, adverbium. Then we have interjectio. In English, these are called interjections. One note here is you'll see that there's a letter J. And if you think back to our letter on the Latin letters, our lesson on the Latin letters, we didn't learn a Latin letter J. So where does this letter J come from? Okay? It's simply a letter, the Latin letter E or I. All right? But what happens is, so we could actually take this J out of here and replace it with the letter I or E in Latin. In classical Latin, we would say interjectio. Interjectio. Now we can see that letter, if we break this word into syllables, we'll have interjectio. Interjectio. When that letter E was used at the beginning of a syllable, it took on the sound of the letter Y in English. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's almost like a consonant. So what Christians started to do was, instead of using the I, they used the symbol of what we would call a J. In classical, this would be interjectio. And that Y sound is marked with this letter J. But really, this is the letter E or I in Latin. Okay? So even though there's a letter there that we didn't learn in Latin 1, a written letter, it's simply a different symbol for the Latin letter E, the third Latin vowel. A, E. That's simply the vowel E, but it's used at the beginning of a syllable, pronounced with the sound Y. And it became normal to write that sound with the symbol that we would call J. Okay? Interjectio. Interjectio is an interjection. And lastly, the eighth part of speech is conjunctio. Conjunctio, we have another example of that letter J in Latin, really just the vowel E. Conjunctio. And conjunctio in English is called a conjunction, taken directly from the Latin. So these are the 8 parts of speech. Now what they are, the definitions of them, I may provide a simple definition in your lesson written just for the sake of your knowledge, so you can see these words and have an idea of what they are. But through the course of Latin Grammar 1, the study of the parts of speech is our whole focus. That's what Latin Grammar 1 is. It's the study of etymology, the study of the parts of speech, partes orationis. So we're going to go through Latin 1 and we're going to study every one of these 8 parts of speech, one by one in order. And every time we begin the study of one of the parts of speech, we'll establish a clear definition for what that part of speech is. So you don't need to understand that now, even though, as I said, I'll give you a definition in your lesson, in lesson 2, just to give you an idea of what the different parts of speech are. But we're going to study each one of these one by one in detail through the whole rest of this course. Okay, so you don't need to understand what these are right now. And remember, I don't want you to bring knowledge from English grammar into Latin grammar. We want to learn what these are in the Latin language and not mix it up with what these might be in the English language or even in the Greek language or any other language. So We'll study each of these one by one in full detail, so don't worry if you don't know what these are yet. Okay, we're going to study these. That's the whole point of Latin Grammar 1. Now the second rule in your lesson, this is a short lesson, lesson 2. The second rule, after naming the 8 parts of speech, it says harum quatuor, harum quatuor, and then it lists nomen, pronomen, verbum, participium, declinantur. Harum quatuor, nomen, pronomen, verbum, participium, declinantur. And what that means is of these, harum means of these 8 parts of speech, 4, quatuor, 4, these 4, the first 4, declinantur. Declinantur. That means they are declined. They are declined. Of these, 4 are declined. Nomen, pronomen, verbum, participium. What it means to be declined is that these parts of speech, the words in Latin that belong to each one of these 4 parts of speech, have different forms. Okay, so when we learn about nouns, we're going to learn that each word has a number of different forms. Pronouns have different forms. Verbs and participles have different forms. There's one basic form and then a bunch of other forms because these words are declined. Okay? The way that ideas are expressed using these 4 parts of speech make use of different forms to communicate different ideas. And again, we're going to study that through this whole Latin Grammar 1 course, so don't worry about what that means. Just very simply know that these first 4 parts of speech have different forms that we're going to have to learn. And then cetere, the others, these last 4 parts of speech, the rest, declinationis sunt expertes. That means the others, the other 4 parts of speech of declension are expertes, are free or without. Okay, so the first 4 parts of speech, declinantur, are declined. The other 4 parts of speech are free of declension. That means these 4 parts of speech, we learn one word and there are no other forms. I'll give you a simple example. Conjunction. We saw in lesson 1 the word et. The word et in English means and. When you learn the conjunction et in Latin, there's only one form. There's no other forms. It's just one word. And so these 4 parts of speech are really just simple vocabulary studies. You simply learn a word and what it means, and if you know what part of speech it is, you understand what it does in a sentence, but there's only one form to learn for each of these 4 parts of speech when we learn a word that belongs to one of these classes. An example is et. Another example, if I were to take the preposition sine. Sine means without. Sine is a preposition. It means without. There's only one form of the word sine. It's not declined. There are no other forms. To give you an example of declension over here, if I take the word, well, in our first lesson, we saw the word dictio, which meant word. Okay, we saw dictio, which meant word. Dictio is a noun, nomen. Dictio is declined. So there's going to be other forms of this word. We're going to see, for example, dictionis, dictioni, dictionem. In lesson 1, we also saw dictionibus, dictionibus. The noun, because it's declined, because it's a noun, has different forms. So when we learn these first 4 parts of speech, we're going to learn a word like dictio, but then we're also going to have to study its declension. We're going to have to study all the different forms of that noun. Okay, so we'll get into that in a few lessons when we start the study of nouns. But rule 2 in lesson 2 simply says of these 8 parts of speech, 4 are declined, these first 4. The rest are free of declension. They don't have any declension. There's just one word, and that's it. No other forms. Okay? That's all that lesson 2 contains. So in lesson 2, the real focus is learning the names of the 8 parts of speech. This is like a table of contents for Latin Grammar 1, because what we're going to do from now on is just walk through these one by one all the way to the end of the course. Make sure you know the names of the 8 parts of speech. Make sure you memorize them in this exact order, because this is the order we're going to study them in. And make sure you understand that there are 2 different kinds of parts of speech. The first 4 are declined, and the last 4 are not declined. And then rule 2 simply says that of these, 4 are declined, the others are free of declension. They have only one form. Okay? So that's a summary or introduction to lesson 2 on the partes orationis, the parts of speech. I hope that's a helpful introduction to get you started, to let you hear the pronunciation of each of these names, to walk through the translation of the Latin rules. As I said in lesson 1, I want you to memorize the Latin rules and to study and know the meaning of the Latin in our lesson. And in our next lesson, we're going to learn a bit about all of these parts of speech, and then we're just going to study one part of speech at a time until the end of the course. So it's a very simple course. There's a lot to study because we're learning a whole new language, but it's not difficult. Just follow instructions, take one lesson at a time. This is a self-paced course. You can take your time, study hard, master each lesson, and just move on one step at a time. And by the end of this course, you'll know the Latin language as well as anyone in the world, because very few people get the opportunity to study a grammar textbook like this, written by an old schoolmaster. Okay? It's time now for you to get to work. Your lesson says first study the prelection, which is this video, then study the lesson for mastery, complete all the assigned memory work, and complete your lesson assessments. If you need help at any time, contact us. We're here to help you all the time. If there's something in here you'd like to talk about or you have a question, just get in touch with me and we'll help you answer any questions you have and help you to succeed in your studies. I hope that's a helpful introduction. Time to get to work. God bless your studies.